The morning of December 7, 1941 arrived with a quiet so complete that it seemed almost deliberate. Pearl Harbor lay still beneath a soft Pacific haze, its battleships moored in orderly lines, their steel hulls reflecting an untroubled sky. On the decks, sailors moved without haste, sweeping walkways, brewing coffee, writing letters for mail that would go out on Monday. It was a Sunday shaped by routine, offering no hint that the habits of peace were already out of time. Far beyond the horizon, Tokyo's most ambitious gamble advanced in disciplined silence. 6 carriers of the Japanese First Air Fleet carved a thin wake through the northern Pacific, hidden by weather and distance. Above their decks waited 353 aircraft, torpedo bombers fitted with newly modified fins, dive bombers tuned for precision, and fighters primed to sweep the skies clean. Each machine represented a belief cultivated within Japan's war councils, that a single, decisive stroke could cripple American resolve before war truly began. Aboard the American ships, clocks moved toward 7:55 a.m. with unremarkable certainty. Sailors rose from their bunks, unaware that their world had already narrowed to minutes. The harbor itself seemed to guard them, its calm waters offering reassurance that no threat could reach so deep into the Pacific. Yet the sky above Oahu had already changed. The first wave of attackers emerged from the clouds in disciplined formations, their engines blending into a single mechanical hum, steady, purposeful, and final. When the torpedoes were released, they cut the water with a precision that denied any possibility of misunderstanding. Seconds later, the first bombs fell, each detonation breaking the quiet with a force that seemed to tear the morning in half. Smoke lifted above Battleship Row in a slow, dark column, rising through the same sky that had looked so harmless only moments before. In that smoke lay the collapse of assumptions, the end of illusions, and the beginning of a war that would reach every corner of the globe. Shock, history would show, is never the conclusion of a story. It is only the first tremor. And as the harbor burned, another question formed in the distance: what would rise from the ruins now taking shape? News reached Tokyo with the clarity of a long-awaited vindication. Radio operators relayed coded messages from the strike force, and as each line was deciphered, the scale of the attack became unmistakable. Battleships burning, airfields shattered, American forces caught in the very moment of unprepared peace. In offices across the imperial capital, senior officers allowed themselves a rare exhale. For many, it felt like the confirmation of a belief they had carried for years. That boldness, executed with precision, could reshape the world before the world fully understood what had happened. Yet in a quiet room away from the celebratory murmurs, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied the initial reports with a calm that bordered on sorrow. He saw the success clearly, but he also understood the limits of surprise. Torpedoes and bombs could strike a fleet. They could not strike an industrial continent awake. To him, the attack marked not the culmination of strategy, but the beginning of a war Japan was not prepared to sustain. It was a tactical triumph, carrying the weight of a strategic warning. Inside Japan's high command, however, the mood tilted in a different direction. Senior planners interpreted Pearl Harbor not as the opening act of a long conflict, but as a decisive conclusion, an explosive gesture meant to force the United States into negotiation. Propaganda amplified this assumption immediately. Newspapers prepared headlines declaring that American naval power had been broken in a single morning, and that Washington, confronted with the scale of its losses, would choose diplomacy over determination. Beneath these proclamations rested a belief both simple and profound. America possessed immense factories but a fragile spirit. Japan's leaders assumed that once struck sharply enough, the United States would recoil rather than rise. It was a reading of national character based more on hope than observation, yet it shaped every decision made in those first hours of victory. But even in celebration, a faint miscalculation lingered beneath the surface, quiet but persistent. Japan believed it had ended the war before it truly began. In reality, each triumphant message carried the first echo of a consequence no one was yet willing to name, an echo that would grow louder with every passing day. When the first reports reached the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt listened in a silence that carried more weight than any outburst could. For a moment, the enormity of the attack stood unchallenged. Battleships overturned, airfields burning, lives measured in rising columns of smoke. But disbelief lasted only an instant. Around him, the room seemed to contract into purpose. What formed in Roosevelt's expression was, Not despair, but a cold, disciplined clarity. The nation had been struck, and the response would have to match the scale of the wound. Within 24 hours, Congress assembled in a session marked not by debate, but by unity rare in the nation's history. The attack had done what years of political argument could not. It forged a single intent. The vote for war passed with overwhelming force, and in that moment, public shock shifted into something steadier. A country that had spent decades balancing isolation with obligation now found the balance decided for it. The question was no longer whether America would enter the war, but how fully it would commit itself. Across the nation, industry stirred from its long peacetime rhythm. Factories accustomed to building cars and appliances began retooling for engines, armor plating, and aircraft construction. The scale of the transformation was without precedent. In cities from Detroit to Seattle, machines roared back to life, each assembly line becoming an unspoken pledge that Pearl Harbor would not stand unanswered. The industrial capacity Japan had dismissed as slow and unwieldy was beginning to shift, and once it gathered momentum, it would become one of the defining forces of the conflict. On the streets, the human response unfolded with equal magnitude. Recruitment centers filled from dawn until dusk as civilians lined up to enlist, many still wearing the clothes they had on when they first heard the news. Their anger did not erupt outward. Instead, it condensed into discipline, into an acceptance that the coming years would demand endurance rather than rage. Strategists began drafting a 6-month plan to halt Japan's expansion before it could solidify its gains, a timetable born not of optimism, but of necessity. Across the Pacific, Japanese leaders read these movements as expected bluster, a noisy but temporary reaction. They did not yet see the deeper shift taking place. Pearl Harbor had not broken American resolve. It had concentrated it, and in that concentration lay the beginning of a force Japan had never fully measured, one that would soon reshape the Pacific's balance of power. In the weeks that followed Pearl Harbor, Japanese war planners outlined a vision of victory that appeared, at first glance, both elegant and inevitable. The empire's strategy rested on a swift expansion across Southeast Asia, securing oil fields, mineral reserves, and vital shipping lanes before the United States could marshal its strength. Once these resources were firmly in Japanese hands, the plan called for constructing a defensive perimeter, an island fortress stretching from the Kurils to the Solomons, one so vast and heavily armed that any counterattack would demand a cost no democracy would willingly pay. In Tokyo's eyes, this was not ambition. It was arithmetic. Their confidence was shaped by the precedent of earlier victories. Against Russia in 1905, Japan had demonstrated its ability to strike decisively and negotiate from a position of strength. The planners believed the same formula would hold again: overwhelm the enemy early, break their expectations, and impose a settlement before the war grew too large to control. To Japan's high command, the conflict was not destined to become a struggle of attrition. It was meant to be short, sharp, and psychologically decisive, a clash resolved not by industrial capacity, but by will. At the heart of this strategy lay a single assumption: that the United States, with its distant territories and vast oceanic divide, would hesitate to endure a long Pacific war. They expected American public opinion to erode under the weight of distance, casualties, and uncertainty. Tokyo's leaders believed that if they could demonstrate dominance in the early months, across Malaya, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies, Washington would seek terms that acknowledged Japan's new sphere of influence. It was a view rooted not in hostility, but in misreading. And for a time, events seemed to validate the vision. Japanese forces advanced with remarkable speed, overrunning strategic territories in a sequence that appeared almost seamless. Airfields fell, harbors were captured, and resource hubs long coveted by Tokyo came under the rising sun's control. Each victory fed the illusion of unstoppable momentum, reinforcing the belief that history was falling into alignment with expectation. In the glow of success, the war planners saw confirmation, not warning. The Imperial Navy identified only one significant obstacle to the consolidation of their gains: the American aircraft carriers still roaming the Pacific. These vessels, absent from Pearl Harbor on the morning of the attack, represented the one variable Japanese strategists could not fully account for. Yet even this concern was tempered by optimism. The Navy expected the carriers to be located and destroyed in the coming months, removed before they could disrupt the expansion's fragile timb. Edible, in their predictive models, The Pacific was a chessboard missing its most dangerous pieces. But Yamamoto, watching events unfold with the long view of a man who understood America's potential, sensed the gathering risk. Each territorial gain stretched Japan's supply lines farther across the ocean. Each newly occupied port demanded fuel, manpower, and shipping capacity that Tokyo could not easily replace. To him, victory was beginning to resemble a corridor narrowing with every step taken. The empire was expanding, yes, but also drifting deeper into a logistical labyrinth from which retreat would be nearly impossible. Here, the narration's parallel becomes clear. Momentum is not strategy, and expansion is not endurance. Japan's war planners believed they were shaping the end of the conflict. In truth, they were only shaping the conditions for the struggle that was still to come, one that would reveal just how quickly early triumphs could become burdens heavier than any empire had planned to bear. In the opening months of 1942, Japan advanced across the Pacific with a speed that appeared almost effortless. Guam fell first, its small garrison unable to withstand the precision of the assault. Wake Island followed after a desperate defense, its final radio transmissions fading into the static of defeat. Hong Kong capitulated after a brutal siege, and in the Philippines, where General MacArthur's forces fought against starvation as much as against soldiers, the outcome became unavoidable. Each victory seemed to confirm that Japan's military machine possessed a momentum no opponent could halt. For the Imperial General Staff, these reports were more than battlefield updates. They were signals that history itself was bending in Japan's favor. Inside Tokyo's war rooms, confidence grew with each communique. Officers traced new perimeters on wall-sized maps, marking captured ports and expanding supply lines with strokes of ink that felt like strokes of destiny. The belief hardened that Japan had entered a period of near invincibility, its forces superior in skill, daring, and cohesion. The early war had unfolded exactly as planned, and in that precise alignment, many officers saw confirmation of a deeper truth, that the empire's rise had become inevitable. But beneath the triumphs, small fractures began to form, subtle enough to overlook, yet sharp enough to threaten the entire structure. Aircraft losses, though acceptable on paper, began to erode the trained pilot corps that Japan could not easily replace. The merchant fleet, burdened by expanding supply needs, sailed longer routes through increasingly hostile waters. Fuel reserves, critical to any future operations, dwindled at a rate that alarmed logisticians but not strategists. The glow of success obscured these warnings, turning real constraints into background noise. Japan's leadership, buoyed by momentum, continued to view American forces through the lens of underestimation. To them, the United States was untested in the Pacific, its soldiers inexperienced, its admirals clinging to outdated doctrine. They assumed that early defeats would fracture American morale and that industrial strength, while impressive, would take too long to mobilize into meaningful power. It was a vision shaped not by intelligence, but by expectation, a portrait of an enemy drawn to match the narrative Tokyo preferred to believe. Across the ocean, the U.S. Navy was drawing a very different picture. Analysts sifted through the wreckage of the early battles, studying Japanese attack patterns, carrier formations, and torpedo tactics. Every loss became a lesson, every failure an opportunity to adapt. What Japan viewed as proof of superiority, the Americans treated as data, information that would soon shape new strategies, new technologies, and a new understanding of how the war must be fought. Yet Tokyo misread the silence. To them, the absence of immediate American counterattacks signaled hesitation, even weakness. Each passing week of Japanese expansion reinforced the illusion that superiority had become permanent. This was not confidence born of strategy, but confidence born of ease, victory arriving too smoothly, too quickly, too consistently. And so the narration settles on the quiet truth that history often reserves for later reflection. Arrogance thrives when victory seems effortless, and blindness grows strongest in the light of early triumph. What Japan celebrated as confirmation was, in fact, only the beginning of a distortion, one that would soon collide with a reality far more complex than the map lines drawn in those first triumphant months. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, American strategists confronted a reality that allowed for no hesitation. The Pacific Fleet had been wounded, the nation's defenses shaken, and the enemy still advancing across thousands of miles of ocean. Yet instead of withdrawing into caution, the United States adopted a plan so direct that it appeared rare. seek less at first glance, strike Japanese positions again and again, even before true readiness had been restored. The logic was austere but compelling. Pressure must be met with pressure. Momentum must be answered with disruption. Japan had seized the initiative. America would deny them the chance to secure it. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts began to transform almost overnight. Where workers once built merchant vessels and passenger liners, new keels now took shape. Destroyers, escort carriers, and fleet carriers rising from steel frameworks with a speed no military planner had considered possible months earlier. In places like Newport News and San Francisco, the sound of riveting became the rhythm of a nation preparing for a different future. Production goals that once seemed ambitious became minimum expectations. The United States was not merely replenishing its losses, it was constructing the arsenal that would define the next phase of the war. While shipyards forged steel answers to Japan's advance, another battle unfolded in rooms where the doors remained locked and the windows shuttered. U.S. cryptanalysts, working with fragments of intercepted messages, began to break into the Japanese naval code system. Their progress was incremental at first, each breakthrough the result of long hours and careful inference. But gradually, patterns emerged, routes, timetables, intentions. Through these decryptions, the Pacific transformed from a vast uncertainty into a landscape illuminated by intelligence. Warfare was gaining a new dimension, one in which information would shape outcomes before fleets ever engaged. Amid this growing clarity, a proposal reached the highest levels of command, an air raid on Japan itself. The idea was improbable, bordering on symbolic, launching B-25 bombers from the deck of an American carrier, striking Tokyo, and then pushing forward to uncertain landings in China. Yet the symbolic was precisely the point. The Doolittle raid, soon approved, would demonstrate that distance offered no protection and that the United States would not remain passive. It was designed not to inflict strategic damage, but to pierce the veneer of Japanese invulnerability. But Tokyo misinterpreted each of these developments. The accelerated shipbuilding, the probing attacks, even the audacity of the Doolittle raid. Japanese leadership viewed them as gestures born of desperation, signs that America was struggling to regain balance rather than gathering strength. The empire's early victories had created a lens through which all enemy actions appeared diminished. Confidence, once a tool, now became a barrier. Yamamoto sensed the danger beneath the triumph, but even he could not stem the rising tide of certainty sweeping through the high command. Victory had come too quickly, too easily, and had made its own argument. Few wished to question it. And so the stage was set. The next 6 months would reveal the cost of believing a war ends when you choose it to, and the deeper truth that some illusions do not fade gently. They are shattered. Across the United States, the shock of Pearl Harbor gradually hardened into a national discipline. What began as grief evolved into resolve, and resolve soon became labor, measured not in speeches or proclamations, but in the steady rhythm of factories that no longer slept. American industry shifted into a mode of production without precedent, converting assembly lines, retraining workers, and reimagining peacetime infrastructure as instruments of war. Detroit, once known for its chrome and comfort, now earned a new title, the Arsenal of Democracy. The name was not a metaphor. It was a description of output so immense it defied familiar scales of comparison. Inside these factories, the transformation was immediate and uncompromising. Automakers who had spent decades perfecting the craft of mass production now applied their expertise to tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks. The transition to continuous, 24-hour operation demanded coordination on a level no private enterprise had attempted before. Steel mills glowed through the night, their furnaces feeding the demands of a nation determined to confront a war thousands of miles away. The change was not merely industrial, it was cultural. A population long accustomed to distance from global conflict now understood that distance offered no immunity. From these foundries and assembly halls, the new American Navy began to take shape. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and escort vessels rolled off production lines at a pace that left foreign observers unsure whether the numbers were accurate. A carrier that once required several years to build could now be launched in a fraction of that time. Destroyers emerged in waves. Submarines slipped into the water with a frequency that hinted at an industrial rhythm Japan could never hope to match. It was not simply quantity, it was acceleration, the steady compression of production timelines as each month passed. Parallel to this material surge came a technological awakening. American engineers, working with urgency, closed gaps that had existed on December 7 and began to widen them in their own favor. Radar systems, once experimental, became standard equipment on ships and aircraft. Fire control systems grew more precise, enabling gunners to track targets with a level of accuracy that reshaped naval combat. Aircraft designers produced new models, fighters capable of absorbing damage and diving steeply, bombers with longer range and heavier payloads. Innovation, driven by necessity, pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Yet machines were only as effective as the people who operated them. Recognizing the urgency of training a new generation of aviators, the U.S. Navy established programs that expanded at astonishing speed. Airfields from Florida to California buzzed with activity as instructors drilled thousands of recruits in navigation, formation flying, gunnery, and carrier landings. Experience, lost so painfully at Pearl Harbor, was rebuilt through relentless repetition. Mistakes were made in safe skies, so they would not be made in hostile ones. The Navy was not merely replacing pilots. It was forging a corps capable of confronting an enemy that once seemed untouchable. As training accelerated, the Pacific Fleet underwent its own metamorphosis. No longer built around battleships, the fleet reorganized into fast-moving task forces centered on surviving carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and others soon to join them. These vessels became not only symbols of American resilience but the strategic core of a new doctrine: mobility over mass, precision over intimidation. Task forces trained relentlessly, practicing maneuvers that would define carrier warfare, coordinated strikes, rapid withdrawals, and the delicate art of keeping the enemy perpetually uncertain. In these formations, the United States found a weapon capable of reaching across the vastness of the Pacific. Meanwhile, Japan confronted a starkly different reality. The empire's early victories had come at the cost of pilots whose skill could not be replicated quickly. Aircraft production, limited by resources and industrial capacity, struggled to keep pace with combat losses. Each downed fighter represented not just metal but months of training. Each lost bomber weakened Japan's ability to project power. The disparity grew quietly at first, visible in statistics rather than battles, but its implications deepened with every week. Japan had mastered the art of rapid conquest. It had not prepared for the endurance required to sustain it. Here, the narration pauses to acknowledge the deeper truth emerging beneath the steel, the strategy, and the sweat. War does not create strength. It reveals it. America's advantage did not come from invulnerability, nor from the absence of early loss. It came from the ability to absorb shock, reorganize, innovate, and expand, traits rooted not in weaponry, but in the character of a nation forced to confront a challenge greater than any it had imagined. And as these new ships slipped into the Pacific, as pilots rose from freshly built runways, and as intelligence flowed through newly cracked codes, the illusion of Japanese invincibility began to thin. The arsenal was ready. The next test would come not in factories or classrooms, but on the open ocean, where belief and reality would finally collide. By the spring of 1942, the United States faced a strategic question that reached far beyond ships or territory: how to restore a sense of agency after months of uninterrupted Japanese victories. The answer arrived not in the form of a grand offensive, but in an audacious proposal whose purpose was almost entirely symbolic. The plan called for 16 B-25 bombers, land-based aircraft never intended for carrier operations, to launch from the deck of the USS Hornet, fly more than 600 miles to Japan, strike Tokyo and other cities, and then continue toward uncertain landings in China. Militarily, the expected damage was modest. But psychologically, the strike promised to do what statistics and production figures could not: remind both nations that America still possessed reach, will, and imagination. Training for the mission began under conditions so unorthodox that many participants doubted the plan could ever be executed. Pilots practiced short takeoffs on runways marked with carrier-length boundaries. Crews rehearsed navigation routes that depended on variables no one could fully control, including weather, Japanese air defenses, and fuel consumption across unfamiliar terrain. Yet as preparations progressed, skepticism gave way to determination. The operation's improbability became part of its strength. If it succeeded, it would signal that Japan's early achievements had not sealed the future. On April 18, 1942, the moment of commitment arrived. The Hornet, escorted by Task Force 16, pushed as close to Japan as operational security allowed. When the task force was detected prematurely by Japanese picket vessels, the decision was made to launch immediately, hours earlier and miles farther from the target than planned. Deck crews stood in the cold spray of the North Pacific as Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle guided the first bomber forward. One by one, 16 B-25s lifted into the wind, their engines straining as they rose from a platform never designed to hold them. Each departure was a gamble, a message carved from risk. The bombers reached Tokyo shortly after noon. The physical damage they inflicted was limited. Small fires, scattered impacts, several industrial sites hit but not destroyed. Yet the psychological effect was profound. For the first time in the war, Japanese civilians witnessed the sky above their capital split by enemy aircraft. Air raid sirens echoed across a city that had believed itself protected by geography, by distance, by the ocean itself. The sense of invulnerability that had shaped Japanese confidence since Pearl Harbor was punctured in a single afternoon. And with that puncture came fear, the fear that a war assumed to be distant could arrive unannounced. Within Japan's high command, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Instead of evaluating the raid's limited strategic impact, leaders focused on its symbolic violation. Pride demanded restitution, and restitution required a decisive confrontation. The belief hardened that American carriers, the elusive instruments of this insult, had to be drawn into battle and annihilated. In this atmosphere, Yamamoto redirected planning toward a single objective, Midway. By seizing the atoll and threatening Hawaii, he hoped to force the U.S. Navy into a climactic engagement from which it could not recover. But the raid had consequences beyond anger. To protect the home islands from future attacks, Japan was compelled to redistribute aircraft and ships, weakening offensive operations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Convoys were diverted. Patrol lines were extended. Defensive doctrine replaced expansionary momentum. The perimeter Tokyo had struggled to build now required resources it could scarcely spare. What began as a symbolic American gesture produced logistical ripples powerful enough to alter Japan's strategic posture. For the United States, the raid served its intended purpose. It restored morale, demonstrated ingenuity, and signaled that the Pacific was not a one-sided battlefield. The carriers Hornet and Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor as heralds of a new phase in the war, one in which imagination would stand alongside industry as a weapon of equal value. And so the narration closes on the quiet truth illuminated by those 16 bombers. A symbolic strike does not win a war, but it can reshape its trajectory. When an illusion of certainty fractures, even briefly, the strategic landscape beneath it begins to shift. And in Japan's response lay the first steps toward a confrontation that would determine the future of the Pacific. By late spring of 1942, the Pacific no longer felt like an expanse of open water. It had become an intelligence landscape, shaped by fragments of intercepted messages and the disciplined work of cryptanalysts who sifted through patterns invisible to the naked eye. In a quiet room at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, these codebreakers isolated a term, AF, repeated in Japanese naval communications with increasing urgency. Through careful inference and a deliberate test involving a false report of a water shortage, they confirmed what had once been only a suspicion. AF was Midway, a coral atoll whose value came not from its size, but from the leverage it offered over the central Pacific. Japan's next move was no longer a mystery. With this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a decision that defied conventional logic. The Japanese fleet preparing to strike Midway dwarfed the forces available to him. It included 4 frontline carriers, veteran pilots, and the momentum of half a year spent winning nearly every engagement. Yet Nimitz understood that information, accurate, timely, and exploited decisively, could neutralize advantages measured in ships and aircraft. Rather than avoid the approaching storm, he chose to steer toward it. The plan he committed to was audacious, an ambush of a superior enemy in open ocean, relying on timing, deception, and the resilience of a fleet still bearing scars from earlier battles. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown became the pillars of this strategy. After the bruising fight in the Coral Sea, Yorktown had returned to Pearl Harbor battered, her decks scored and her internal systems failing. Engineers were given an impossible timetable, 72 hours to restore a carrier that should have required months of work. Yet crews labored without pause, moving through the ship with the urgency of men who understood that every repaired bulkhead and restored wire served a purpose larger than the vessel itself. When Yorktown sailed again, she was not whole, but she was ready. Across the Pacific, Japanese planners advanced with confidence shaped by assumptions rather than evidence. Their communications, still believed to be secure, outlined an operation designed around surprise. Strike Midway, draw out the surviving American carriers, and crush them beneath overwhelming force. The prospect of an ambush did not enter their calculations. They operated under the belief that initiative once gained could not be reversed. To them, the Pacific still belonged entirely to Japan. As May turned to June, pilots on both sides prepared for a battle whose scale neither nation fully comprehended. Americans studied reconnaissance photos, reviewed attack procedures, and rehearsed formations that left no room for hesitation. Many were young, some barely trained, but each understood that the coming clash would test not only skill but endurance. Japanese aviators, veterans of success stretching back to the first days of the war, refined their methods with the confidence of men who believed they were entering the next chapter of an unbroken ascent. Both groups looked toward the horizon, knowing that history rarely announces the moment when it shifts. The Pacific itself became a chessboard stretched across thousands of miles, where every decision was measured not simply in strategy, but in fuel calculations, wind direction, and seconds gained or lost. Carrier groups maneuvered without sight of one another, guided only by reconnaissance reports and intuition. The ocean concealed both danger and opportunity, holding them in a tension that grew sharper with each passing hour. Every move carried consequences that none of the participants could fully foresee. And so the narration arrives at the threshold of inevitability. Intelligence had set the pieces. Preparation had shaped the players. Now two fleets, driven by belief, ambition, and the momentum of 6 months of war, moved toward a confrontation neither could avoid. In this convergence, struggle began to transform into fate, where innovation, courage, and uncertainty would meet in a battle that would redefine the Pacific. Dawn on June 4, 1942, rose over the Pacific with a muted metallic light, the kind that seems to hold its breath before revealing what comes next. As the sun lifted above the horizon, Japanese reconnaissance confirmed what their plan had predicted. Midway Atoll lay ahead, small, flat, and vulnerable. Following their established doctrine, Japanese commanders launched the first strike of the day, squadrons of bombers and fighters rising from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu in disciplined formation. Their objective was straightforward: neutralize the island before American carriers could intervene. What they did not know, what no pilot in the formation could yet imagine, was that 3 American carriers were already in position, hidden beyond the curve of the horizon, watching and waiting. On Midway itself, the stillness of morning gave way to alarm sirens. Marine pilots scrambled into the sky, their aircraft older and slower than the planes approaching from the northwest. Yet they climbed regardless, holding to the principle that resistance, however costly, bought time. In the minutes that followed, the air above the island became a crucible. American fighters were outnumbered, outmatched, and outmaneuvered. Many were shot down before completing their first turn. Others pressed on through streams of tracers, engines shaking under the strain. The defenders inflicted damage but could not stop the bombing run that followed. Midway burned, but it did not break. While the island endured its punishment, the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, moved into attack positions. Their commanders understood the stakes. If the Japanese carriers were not struck early, they would recover their aircraft, rearm for a second wave, and seize full control of the battle. What followed were orders shaped not by certainty but by necessity. Torpedo squadrons were launched first, even though their aircraft were slow, lightly armored, and lacked fighter escort. Their mission bordered on impossible: fly directly toward the most experienced naval aviators in the world and attack a fleet whose defenses had never been breached. The torpedo crews pressed on anyway. One squadron after another descended to low altitude, engines roaring just above the water as they lined up for attack runs. Japanese fighters struck from above with devastating precision. Aircraft fell burning into the sea, pilots bilayed out only to witness their comrades vanish beneath waves. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that pressed the attack that morning, 35 were shot down. Entire units were nearly erased. Yet their sacrifice achieved something no tactical manual could have predicted. By forcing the Japanese combat air-P. Atoll to descend to low altitude, they disrupted the vertical layers of defense that had protected the carriers since the beginning of the war. The sky above the fleet, normally guarded by disciplined fighters, briefly opened. At that moment, high above the chaos, a different group of American aircraft approached. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, guided by fragments of radio reports and navigational calculation, arrived over the Japanese fleet at the precise moment when the defensive screen lay fractured. Below them, the carriers were caught in transition, decks laden with fueled aircraft, crews rearming for their next strike, hangars filled with munitions. It was the most vulnerable window a carrier could offer, and it had opened without warning. The dive bombers rolled into their descents. Engines screamed as pilots aligned their sights on targets that filled the horizon with firepower and prestige. The first bombs hit Kaga, igniting gasoline and detonating stacked ordnance. Minutes later, Akagi, flagship of the strike force, was struck by a single bomb that plunged through the flight deck and triggered a cascade of explosions. Soryu followed, flames rising through its hangars in towering columns. The transformation was immediate and irreversible. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor, were engulfed in fire so intense that steel warped and decks collapsed. On the surviving Japanese vessels, disbelief settled like ash. The empire that had believed a single strike could end American resistance now watched its own naval heart suffer a blow it could neither explain nor counter. The shock that had once belonged to Pearl Harbor returned across the ocean, its direction reversed. And in that reversal lay a truth that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Momentum is fragile, and certainty can disappear in the span of a few minutes. As smoke coiled upward into the widening sky, the battle was far from over. One Japanese carrier still remained, and the day had more turns to give. But the tide, long assumed to flow only one way, had shifted. What Japan had considered the culmination of its rise was now becoming the beginning of its reckoning. By early afternoon on June 4, 1942, the surface of the Pacific reflected more than sunlight. It reflected the shattering of an illusion. 3 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, lay mortally wounded. Flames poured from ruptured decks. Aircraft, fuel, and ordnance fused into a single storm of destruction. The blow was not merely tactical. It cut into the core of Japan's offensive power, removing in minutes the very ships that had carried the empire from Pearl Harbor to the heights of Southeast Asia. On paper, a fleet still sailed. In reality, a strategy had already begun to collapse. Yet one carrier remained, Huryu, the 4th pillar of the Japanese strike force. On her deck, officers moved with disciplined urgency, refusing to accept the scale of the disaster unfolding around them. Radio operators tracked the last known position of the American carriers. Armorers loaded torpedoes with practiced efficiency. The ship's air group, hardened by 6 months of relentless victory, launched into the afternoon sky with a clarity of purpose shaped not by hope, but by defiance. If the day was to be lost, they intended to lose it fighting. Their counterstrike found Yorktown first. Diving through broken cloud cover, Japanese pilots executed an attack with the precision that had defined their early war triumphs. Bombs tore through the carrier's decks, fires erupted, the ship shuddered under the impact. Damage control teams battled flames with hoses, sandbags, and resolve. For a moment, it seemed Yorktown might be finished. But American crews had trained for catastrophe, and their discipline held. The carrier steadied herself and recovered aircraft even as smoke rose from her decks. She had been hit, but she had not been silenced. A second wave from Huryu followed minutes later. This time, Yorktown absorbed torpedo strikes that ripped into her starboard side. The ship listed badly, power flickered, and still she remained afloat. To the Japanese aviators circling above, the persistence of the American carrier seemed uncanny, as though the Pacific itself refused to let her go. But below the waterline, her fate had been sealed. Yorktown would endure a while longer, but she could no longer return to the fight. While the Japanese celebrated what they believed to be the sinking of 2 separate carriers, unaware both attacks had struck the same ship, American scouts finally located Huryu. With the sun dropping lower in the west, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown rose for the retaliation that would decide the day. They found the Japanese carrier exposed, her decks crowded with aircraft preparing for another strike. The attack came with the same suddenness that had doomed her sister ships earlier that morning. Bombs pierced He flight deck, igniting fuel and ammunition in a chain reaction of fire. Flames engulfed the carrier from bow to stern, and within hours, the vessel that had attempted to salvage Japan's fortunes slipped beneath the sea. By nightfall, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan had lost 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, along with more than 200 aircraft and, most critically, the irreplaceable aircrews who had defined the Empire's early dominance. The loss reached beyond hardware. It extinguished the experienced aviators whose knowledge could not be manufactured, who had refined their craft through years of training and months of uninterrupted success. These were men Japan had no capacity to replace quickly, if at all. In Tokyo, early reports of the disaster circulated in stunned fragments. Admirals struggled to reconcile the scale of the loss with the confidence they had carried into the operation. For months, the Empire had expanded outward with the momentum of a force destined to prevail. Now, in a single day, that certainty dissolved. Questions emerged not only about tactics and intelligence, but about the strategic foundation of the war itself. If Japan could lose so much so quickly, what else could unravel? The myth of naval supremacy, carefully cultivated through victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, began to fracture. The ships at the bottom of the Pacific were not merely losses. They were symbols of an assumption that had guided Japan's entire war plan. That initiative belonged to those who seized it early and held it. But initiative, as Midway revealed, is a fragile possession. It shifts, it responds, and once lost, it may not return. In the quiet that followed the battle, one truth took shape with undeniable clarity. Midway was not simply a defeat. It was the end of Japan's ability to choose the war's direction. From this point forward, Japan would react, adjust, endure. But it would not command the pace of the conflict again. And as the Pacific darkened on June 4, the tide, long assumed to flow in one direction, had finally turned. In the span of 6 months, the Pacific War had transformed in ways few strategists could have imagined on the morning of December 7, 1941. Japan had begun its campaign with the confidence of a nation convinced it understood both its enemy and the limits of industrial warfare. Yet by June 1942, the trajectory that once seemed fixed had curved sharply in the opposite direction. Midway did more than sink ships. It overturned assumptions, revealing that the United States, far from collapsing under surprise and humiliation, possessed a capacity for recovery that defied precedent. A conflict Japan believed would be short now stretched forward with an unsettling inevitability. Japan's industrial heart could not keep pace with the demands of a modern naval war. Where the United States could replace aircraft carriers in months, Japan required years. Where America trained pilots through a pipeline that expanded with every passing week, Japan relied on a cadre of veterans whose experience, once lost, could not be rebuilt quickly enough. The destruction of 4 carriers at Midway was not simply a tactical defeat. It created a structural imbalance that widened with each new battle. For the first time since the war began, Japanese commanders looked at their fleet and saw subtraction rather than expansion. Meanwhile, American forces shifted from endurance to initiative. No longer reacting to enemy movements, they began shaping the next phase of the war. The island of Guadalcanal, dense, humid, and strategically essential, became the focus of this new momentum. Plans emerged for the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, a campaign designed not only to halt Japanese expansion, but to reverse it. The decision to strike there signaled a profound change. The United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was preparing to reclaim control of the ocean. For Japan, this transition marked the start of a conflict it could not hope to win, a war of attrition dictated by industrial output, logistical endurance, and the ability to replace losses that all modern powers suffered. Japan's early victories, impressive as they were, had concealed a fatal truth. The empire's strength was finite. What looked like momentum had been speed without sustainability. Now, every battle drained resources that the home islands could not replenish. Each lost pilot represented training hours Japan could not afford to repeat. Each damaged ship strained a naval infrastructure already stretched thin. Across Japan, civilians received heavily moderated accounts of the war's progress. Newspapers reported setbacks rather than disasters, offering reassurances rather than explanations. Yet even through the layers of censorship, a sense of unease began to seep into public consciousness. Families noticed the absence of letters from sons and brothers. Rumors circulated about ships that had failed. To return. For many, it was not the facts but the silence that revealed the growing scale of the crisis. A nation that had been promised quick victory now found itself waiting for truths that never fully arrived. Amid these quiet shifts, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced a reality he had long feared. Privately, he acknowledged the consequences of initiating war against a country whose industrial depth exceeded Japan's by magnitudes. He understood that tactical success could not compensate for strategic imbalance. Midway, in his view, had not created a new trajectory. It had exposed the one Japan had been on since the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. His warning before the war, that he could run wild for 6 months but could promise nothing beyond that, had come to life with exacting precision. And so the narration reaches its turning point, marked not by explosions or declarations but by the accumulation of consequence. The 6 months Japan believed would secure victory instead ensured defeat. The empire had awakened a nation capable of transforming shock into strength, loss into resolve, and uncertainty into direction. From this moment onward, the question no longer concerned whether the tide would turn. It concerned how far it would roll. The next chapter would reveal that Midway was not an end, but a beginning, one that would carry the war into new and unforgiving terrain. In the months following Midway, the Pacific no longer resembled the map Japan had envisioned at the start of the war. The bold lines of expansion that once radiated from Tokyo began to contract, bending inward as American offensives pressed against the perimeter. What had been a war of sweeping movement transformed into a war of extraction. Every island, every anchorage, every outpost requiring resources that Japan could no longer provide in abundance. The empire that had surged across oceans now found itself searching for places to stand. Guadalcanal became the first and most unrelenting test of this new reality. There, in dense jungle and unforgiving heat, the initiative shifted decisively to the United States. American forces fought not only to hold ground, but to drain the strength of a military power that had never prepared for a prolonged struggle. The Japanese soldiers who landed on the island in later months arrived exhausted, hungry, and without the logistical support their predecessors had enjoyed. Each battalion was weaker than the one before it. Each counterattack cost more than it could possibly gain. Japan could still fight fiercely, but no longer sustainably. As the offensives expanded across the Solomon Islands and into the Central Pacific, the cost of every engagement grew heavier. Japanese commanders understood the stakes with a clarity their earlier confidence had obscured. Each aircraft lost now represented more than metal. It represented an irreplaceable pilot, often trained through years of effort, and deployed into battle before he had time to absorb the lessons of war. Where Japan had once fielded some of the finest aviators in the world, it now relied on increasingly younger pilots whose skills, through no fault of their own, had been shaped by haste rather than expertise. Meanwhile, American pilots matured through a system of rotation that allowed combat experience to accumulate and circulate. Veterans taught new recruits. Mistakes became doctrine. Survival bred mastery. U.S. squadrons grew more coordinated with every campaign, their strength compounded by an industrial base that supplied them with more advanced aircraft, more fuel, and more replacement parts than Japan could ever hope to match. The skies that had once favored Japanese Zero fighters now tilted decisively toward Allied air power. At sea, the change was even more stark. The Imperial Navy, pride of Asia, symbol of Japan's modern identity, began to fade into the shadows of its earlier self. Losses from Midway could not be undone, and the ships that remained found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outmatched. Fuel shortages curtailed training exercises. Maintenance crews struggled with dwindling supplies of steel and spare parts. Battleships that had once steamed confidently across the Pacific now remained in port for lack of fuel. Japan's naval superiority had not been defeated in a single moment. It had been eroded, piece by piece, by the weight of industrial disparity. On the home front, Japan's war economy strained under the pressure of demands it could not satisfy. Factories lacked raw materials. Shipyards faced shortages of skilled labor. The nation's infrastructure buckled under the cumulative cost of a conflict far more expansive and prolonged than its architects had intended. Civilians felt the war through rationing, through the absence of young men, through the subtle shift in the tone of official broadcasts that spoke increasingly of resolve rather than victory. The optimism of early 1942 had given way to a quieter, more anxious determinati. As American forces advanced through the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and toward the Marianas, a transformation occurred within Japanese strategic thought. Pearl Harbor, once celebrated as a moment of audacity and triumph, began to cast a different shadow. What had been hailed as a decisive opening move now revealed itself as a profound miscalculation. an attack that awakened a nation whose industrial depth, once engaged, could exert pressures no early victory could counterbalance. The very success of the strike had concealed the long-term consequences it had set in motion. And so the narration settles on a truth often overlooked in the retelling of war. Consequences rarely arrive as thunder. More often, they come as erosion, slow, steady, and undeniable. Japan's long defeat did not begin with a single battle or a single loss. It began with the gradual realization that the empire had entered a war it could not outbuild, outproduce, or outlast. In this recognition lies the quiet turning of history, a shift that would soon deepen as American forces moved closer to the heart of the Pacific, toward territories whose loss Japan could not endure. By 1943, Japan stood at a crossroads it had never imagined for itself. The victories that once defined its early war narrative had faded into a distant memory, replaced by withdrawals, shortages, and the quiet acknowledgement that the empire's ambitions had exceeded its endurance. Within Tokyo's war leadership, a struggle unfolded not only across maps and supply charts, but within the minds of those who had orchestrated the conflict. The confidence that had shaped their decisions now met the unyielding weight of reality. And reality, unlike belief, offered no room for interpretation. Reports arriving from the front grew more troubling with each passing month. Garrisons cut off from supply lines radioed desperate messages requesting reinforcements that no longer existed. Destroyers tasked with escorting convoys found themselves low on fuel before they even left port. Carrier pilots, once the pride of the Navy, returned from missions with dwindling numbers, their replacements younger, less trained, and painfully aware of the shoes they were expected to fill. Japanese commanders reviewed these updates in meetings marked by long silences, pauses in which the truth hung heavier than any spoken assessment. Ordinary civilians felt the strain with a clarity that propaganda could not obscure. Rationing spread from the cities to rural districts. Rice bowls grew smaller. Substitute materials appeared where familiar goods had once been common. The sound of air raid sirens became part of the rhythm of daily life, a reminder that the war no longer lay at the empire's borders but had begun to seep inward. Factories worked to their limits, yet output declined as steel and fuel became scarce. Even in a society accustomed to sacrifice, the cumulative weight of deprivation began to erode confidence in an ultimate victory. The nation built on the assumption of quick triumph now confronted the burden of endless struggle. Japan's imperial vision had depended on momentum, on the belief that decisive blows could shape diplomacy, intimidate rivals, and secure resources needed for long-term stability. But momentum, once lost, revealed an infrastructure unprepared for a sustained conflict against a country with industrial capabilities far greater than its own. Each passing month deepened the imbalance. Each new battle shifted further in America's favor. American strategy had grown increasingly systematic. What began with isolated offensives evolved into a coherent campaign aimed at dismantling Japan's defensive perimeter island by island. The method was deliberate: seize airfields, dominate sea lanes, and push the line of conflict closer to the home islands. Japan found itself responding, adjusting, reacting, always a step behind the expanding reach of American air and naval power. The empire that once dictated the pace of war now struggled simply to endure it. Amid these pressures, the war's moral dimension emerged with greater clarity. The questions lingered in officers' quarters, in government offices, and in the minds of civilians who had lost sons, brothers, and fathers. What had driven the nation to this point? Ambition or necessity? Pride or fear? Some military leaders reflected privately on the decisions that had set Japan on this path: the belief in quick victory, the misreading of American resolve, the assumption that industrial disparity could be offset through audacity alone. A few recognized the tragic irony that the characteristics Japan had once counted as strengths, honor, discipline, resistance to concession, now bound it to a war it could not win. But these reflections rarely moved beyond private thought. To question openly was to risk undermining the fragile unity still holding the nation together. For civilians, the moral landscape was even more complex. Families had sent their children a war believing they were defending the empire's future. Now, with each telegram, each empty seat at a dinner table, they began to sense that the war was consuming the very future it promised to protect. Yet loyalty and duty remained powerful forces, strengthened by cultural expectations and the absence of clear alternatives. The nation pressed forward, even as the ground beneath it shifted. And so the narration arrives at a somber truth. War punishes not only the arrogance of leaders, but the lives of those who follow them. The consequences of miscalculation ripple outward, touching farmers and factory workers, sailors and students, mothers and children. Japan had looked into the mirror of war and seen an image shaped by ambition. Now it confronted what lay beneath that reflection, the cost of choices made in confidence but carried out in sacrifice. Ahead, the path would narrow further, leading toward battles whose outcomes would leave no illusions intact. In the years that followed the war, as archives opened and testimonies were gathered, historians attempted to trace the arc of Japan's rise and collapse through the early months of the Pacific conflict. Again and again, they returned to a single conclusion. Japan's defeat did not begin at Midway, nor at Guadalcanal, nor even in the attritional battles that followed. It began at Pearl Harbor, in a misreading so fundamental that it shaped every decision that came afterward. Japan understood America's resources. It understood the size of its navy, the depth of its shipyards, the scale of its industries. But it misunderstood the one factor that could not be measured on charts or tonnage tables, the character of the nation it sought to intimidate. Before December 7, 1941, the United States was divided by debates over isolationism, wary of foreign entanglements, and reluctant to enter a global conflict. But the attack dissolved those divisions in a single morning. Shock did not fracture the public. It fused it. A nation uncertain of its role in the world became a nation united in purpose. The strike intended to shatter American resolve instead awakened it, transforming a distant conflict into a personal struggle etched into every household. What Japan assumed would create hesitation instead created momentum, industrial, military, and emotional. The architects of the attack had hoped for a swift war, a war defined by decisive strikes, rapid negotiations, and limited commitments. Instead, they ignited a total war, one fought across oceans, jungles, and skies with a scale of mobilization unprecedented in modern history. America did not merely respond to Pearl Harbor. It reoriented its entire society around defeating the enemy that had wounded it. That transformation, measured in factories, shipyards, training programs, and collective will, became the turning point long before Midway confirmed it. The 6-month reversal from Japanese dominance to crisis remains one of the most dramatic inflection points in military history. In December, Japan stood at the peak of its power, its navy undefeated, its pilots unmatched, its territorial gains sweeping across the Pacific. By June, 3 of its finest carriers lay on the ocean floor, and the 4th would soon follow. The very momentum that had carried Japan outward now accelerated its vulnerability, pushing it deeper into a conflict for which it lacked the industrial resilience to compete. Never had a strategic position collapsed so rapidly, nor so completely. Pearl Harbor, once celebrated in Tokyo as a masterstroke of planning, gradually assumed a different meaning in the years that followed. It became a symbol of the danger inherent in believing that an adversary's will is weaker than their power. Japan had understood America as a nation of factories, not as a nation of citizens whose determination could surpass productivity alone. The attack struck a fleet, but awakened a country. And that awakening revealed a truth that would shape the remainder of the war. Material strength is potent, but national cohesion, once forged, is nearly unstoppable. In the United States, Pearl Harbor became a rallying point that endured far beyond the immediate shock. It framed the moral dimensions of the conflict, the sense of duty that permeated training fields, shipyards, and battlefronts. Soldiers carried the memory of that morning with them into the Pacific, shaping their understanding of why they fought. The attack became not merely an event, but a narrative, one that deepened rather than diminished with time. It offered clarity in a war filled with ambiguity, purpose in a war defined by sacrifice. For Japan, the narrative evolved differently. Over time, Pearl Harbor came to embody the consequences of strategic overconfidence, the belief that victory could be secured through audacity alone, without regard for the industrial or emotional reaction it might trigger. Scholars and former officers alike identified it as the moment when Japan committed itself to a war it could not sustain, a war whose trajectory was determined not by the brilliance of the opening move, but by the endurance of the opponent. And so the arc of the story closes where it began, with a strike meant to end a conflict before it fully formed, and a nation that emerged from the blow stronger than before. Pearl Harbor did not determine the war's final outcome, but it set in motion the forces that would. In its aftermath, The United States discovered the resolve it had not known it possessed, and Japan discovered the limits of its own assumptions. War, the narration reminds us, is not ended by the strike that begins it, but by the resolve it awakens in those who endure it.